Quote, I know that's a question many of you are asking. Why didn't anyone leave? God knows it would have been easy. We all have draft resignation letters in our desks or on our laptops. That's the half-teasing, half-true advice you get on day one in the Trump administration or immediately following Senate confirmation. Be sure to write your resignation letter. You may need it at a moment's notice or less. Some of us did consider resigning on the spot in the aftermath of the Charlottesville, Virginia conflagration. Quote, one journalist reported a cabinet member saying he would have written a resignation letter, taken it to the president, and shoved it up his... The sentiment was shared, but in the end, no one angrily stormed out. There was no protest resignation. Why do people stay? A close friend asked me at the time. You should all quit. He's a mess. That's why, I responded, because he's a mess. It was true for a lot of us. We thought we could keep it together. The answer feels more hollow than it used to. Maybe my friend was right. Maybe that, in the aftermath of Charlottesville, maybe that was a lost moment when a rush to the exits would have meant something. Joining us now is Ben Rhodes, who's Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama. He's the author of The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House, which he was able to put his name to proudly. Ben, thanks very much for being with us tonight. I really appreciate you making time.
Thanks, Rachel.
So I know that you've been absorbing these new excerpts from this book as I've been delivering them here. I just want to get your top-line reaction. This does feel like a warning from this anonymous Trump administration official.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, look, this isn't surprising. Anybody who's watched this administration and president for 3 years is not surprised to hear these things. I do think, though, we have to understand just how serious this is. People's lives are at stake. People die because of these kinds of incidents that the author writes about. And to be very specific, you read the excerpt of the Iran sanctions poster, for instance. You know, I remember briefing President Obama in groups of people many times, having long briefing memos where President Obama the next morning had read them the night before and would say, well, on page 7, I have a question about, you know, the centrifuges at Fordow, an Iranian nuclear facility. And meanwhile, you know, President Trump just wants to see a sanctions poster. Well, that's our Iran policy right now, is that sanctions poster. Iranians are suffering for it. Medicine is being denied the Iranian people. The Iranians have now resumed their potential nuclear weapons capability, including at that nuclear facility in Fordow. And to get to the point of people dying, if President Trump had been briefed on what would happen to the Kurds when he rashly decided to pull out after one phone call with Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, he would have known that a decision that he made would lead directly to the loss of those Kurdish lives. So these are life and death matters that presidents address. If you don't read the briefing memos, if you don't take the job seriously, real world consequences happen. And that's what I think we need to take away from this. This can look like a reality show. We spend a lot of time talking about small, venal things, often things that Trump tweets. But the president of the United States is responsible for the security, the safety, the prosperity of the American people, and for very complex issues around the world. And it's remarkable to me that here we are 3 years later, and we have someone who's demonstrably unfit for this office, who makes a mockery of an office that is deeply important to the direction of this country and the world. And this person is laying out for us, I think, in really chilling detail, just how demonstrably unfit he is.
I think the other thing that rises right to the top for me, though, almost both in a meta sense and in a direct sense, for now that I've got these excerpts from the book, is the question of the responsibility and the sort of room to maneuver for people who are senior officials inside this administration. I mean, there's the fact that this is being published anonymously. There's the type of, you know, Oval Office behavior, as you were just describing there, around something as serious as the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, you're a senior administration official in the Obama administration. You knew who President Obama was when he got elected and when he performed as president. It's my sense from reading your book and talking to you that he essentially was the president that you thought he would be. Ben, if you had gone in to talk to him about the Iran nuclear deal or something else that serious, and he morphed into the type of person that is described here in this book and started behaving that way and started treating this issue with that kind of lack of gravity, what would you have felt like your responsibility was to do as a senior administration official, seeing the president behave that way? What becomes your responsibility once you're a witness to that?
Well, you know, first of all, part of what's been so difficult about the last 3 years is that I don't think that our system ever anticipated that someone like Donald Trump could become president. The way in which the founders designed the system, the way in which candidates were nominated, someone like this is not supposed to be president of the United States. I don't know how to put it more bluntly than that. The gravity of the job is just too much. I would also say, Rachel, I'm appalled, not necessarily just that this person is anonymous, but there are a lot of people who've seen this president up close who know these things. They need to tell us what they know. There is an election in 1 year. If this president is allowed to be in charge for another 4 years, God help us, Rachel. And the reality is it is getting worse because he's increasingly surrounded by sycophants. He's increasingly surrounded by people who won't listen, who won't tell him what he needs to hear. And that's just going to get worse in his second term. And so what I find really appalling is that all these people who have cycled through, who could tell us what they know, who've been in rooms like the one that author describes, I think they have a responsibility to publicly say what they know. Because the American people have to make a decision that could affect the future of our democracy, the future of the stability of the world in 1 year from just last week. There are people who have things to tell us.
Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor for President Obama. Ben, thank you for being with us tonight to help sort of put this in context. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Rachel.
You do need to understand sort of what a normal White House, even a good White House or a bad White House or well-running presidency or poorly running presidency, you kind of have to understand what senior administration officials, even in a fairly wacky presidency, might see up close and personal in order to see the contrast with what is being described by this author. But again, what we were able to broadcast tonight were the first excerpts from a warning by Anonymous, a senior Trump administration official, raising the prospect that senior administration officials should potentially have resigned en masse after Charlottesville, raising the possibility that the president needs things to be dumbed down for him so much that he can't even, as has previously been reported, handle picture-based briefings or briefings with more than 1 point in them. This is sobering stuff. And I know there's going to be a frenzy around people trying to figure out who this is. And there's lots of controversy over this person doing it anonymously. But the title here is apt. This is a real warning. All right, we'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.